Are the fighting nerds frauds? With Jean Silva losing to Diego Lopes, it's official. All 4 of the original fighting nerds have lost their undefeated UFC records. And at this point, a lot of UFC fans are wondering or thinking that the fighting nerds are actually frauds. But quickly, before we get the video started, my name is JuicyMMA. I make opinionative MMA content. And if you guys are enjoying the content, be sure to hit that subscribe button, as only 10% of you watching are actually subscribed. But also, if you guys are enjoying the content and want to support the channel, be sure to hit that join button for members only live streams, videos, alongside with other perks as well. But anyways, let's get into it. When the fighting nerds originally hopped onto the scene, it seemed like there was 4 legitimately championship caliber fighters, and a lot of fans were talking about the fighting nerds gym as a whole to be one of, if not the best gyms in the entire UFC, as they had Caio, Jean Silva, Mauricio, Ruffy, as well as Carlos Prates. And at a certain point, all of those fighters were not only getting victories and high level victories, but they were also running through their opponents. But after all the hype and excitement, recently something changed. Jean Silva got finished by Diego Lopes, Caio lost to Nasruddin Imavov, Mauricio Ruffy lost to BSD, Carlos Prates lost to Ian Gary. All of the 4 original fighting nerds that were undefeated in the UFC all lost, and they all lost recently. And because all of these fighters have lost, a lot of fans are starting to bring up the question on whether or not they were ever all that good and whether or not they're actually frauds. So, a question that some of you may be wondering at this point is, do I think the fighting nerds are frauds? Well, in my opinion, I have different levels of confidence in each and every fighter of the fighting nerds. But as a broad statement, I do not think the fighting nerds are frauds. Yes, can certain of these fighting nerds get further than other guys? Of course. Do certain fighting nerds maybe not look as good as we originally thought they would? Of course that could be true. But at the end of the day, when you look at Mauricio Ruffy, Caio, Jean Silva, as well as Carlos Prates, I feel like they all have a place in the UFC, and I think they're all going to be at the very least top 12 or top 10 fighters in their respective divisions. And that does include Mauricio Ruffy. Of course, you're not all going to become champions. Of course, you're not even all going to compete for the belt. But at the end of the day, I do still think the fighting nerds are a very talented team, and I do think all of these guys are going to be very successful. But another question that some of you may be wondering at this point is, how would I rank the fighters of the fighting nerds? Well, in my opinion, my ranking would go as follows. Number 1 would be Jean Silva, number 2 would be Caio, number 3 would be Carlos Prates, and number 4 would be Mauricio Ruffy. And all of those fighters, even Mauricio Ruffy at 4, are all going to be very good in my opinion. But just to give more context on my list, for Jean Silva, I talked about this before, and even after he lost to Diego Lopes, I still feel this way. I think Jean Silva is going to become a champion by the end of 2026. I've made multiple videos talking about this before, and even after the Diego Lopes fight, I still feel the same. But essentially, I think he's going to become a champion because of his athleticism, because of his technical ability, and because of his physicality, most importantly. I talk about this in a lot of my videos, but when you talk about Jean Silva for 145, he's one of the most physical fighters at the weight class. The only fighter that may be more physical than him is Diego Lopes, who unfortunately he went up against. But outside of Diego Lopes, I do think Jean Silva is going to have the physicality advantage. If he's able to land a lot of those bombs he was able to land on Diego Lopes, on literally any other fighter at the weight class, I think he probably finds a finish. And yes, there are some adjustments that need to be made from Jean Silva. He does need to do a better job at fighting a little smarter out there. But at the end of the day, whether or not he makes those changes, I honestly still believe he'll become a champion at 145. And for Caio, I think he's proven that he's a legitimate fighter at the middleweight division. He's beaten some really good talent. His fight against Jared Cannonier was an amazing performance from Caio, and even looking back at his fight from Nasruddin Imavov, he definitely lost that fight, and he probably lost a 4-1 on the scorecards, but at the end of the day, every single round was relatively competitive. And if Caio made a couple different changes, maybe he could have won against Imavov, or at the very least, maybe he could have made it a little bit more competitive. But in my opinion, for Caio, I do still think he's a top 5 fighter of the middleweight division, and I do still think he's a legitimate contender at that weight class. Now for Carlos Prates, yes, he did lose to Ian Gary in somewhat of a weird performance, but he almost found the finish at the end. And at this point, after finding a beautiful spinning elbow over Jeff Neal, he's going up against Leon Edwards, and I do believe Leon Edwards is probably a pretty good stylistic matchup for Prates. So if Prates is able to get past Leon Edwards, onwards, the way a lot of fans, including myself, are expecting him to, he can very easily get a title shot in his next fight after his Leon performance. And for Mauricio Ruffy, this is probably the guy that fans are the most low on out of all of the fighting nerds because of how he got dominated by BSD, and a lot of fans don't consider BSD to be a great fighter. But in my opinion, I think the complete opposite. Yes, Mauricio Ruffy did get dominated pretty handedly by BSD, and it was not a great performance at all for Ruffy, but at the end of the day, I just think BSD is just that good as compared to Mauricio Ruffy being that bad. I think BSD is an elite grappler. I've talked about it for a while, and I think Mauricio Ruffy kind of just ran into the best grappler he's ever fought before, and he had a lot of trouble with it. But going forward for Ruffy, I think he will make some changes. I also think he's going to go into some lower level competition to grow his confidence once again, and I think Ruffy is going to be fine going forward. Will he ever become a champion? Honestly, probably not, based on his grappling disadvantages as well as his potential cardio, but at the end of the day, I still think there are a lot of fighters at 155 that he can beat, and I still do think he's going to be a legitimate contender, or at the very least, a legitimate fighter at 155. So overall, yes, all the fighting nerds did lose their undefeated records, and they all lost them in a short amount of time, but at the end of the day, I still think the fighting nerds are a really good team, and I think the original 4 fighters of the fighting nerds are still all going to be very good, with Jean Silva probably being the best out of the team. And I think something that fans continuously fail to notice is a lot of times when they pick out guys that they think are going to be legitimate champions, and they lose one fight, or maybe even they lose 2 fights, they immediately write them off. But there's been countless examples of fighters in the past that had a lot of hype and excitement, lost 1, 2, maybe even more fights in a row, and they ultimately came back to become great fighters, and sometimes they even came back to become champions. Charles Oliveira is a great example of this. A lot of fans didn't really think Charles Oliveira was going to be much initially, but once he went on his ridiculously long win streak towards the tail end of his career, he eventually became a champion, and I think there's a lot of guys that would have a similar experience to that. So just because Jean Silva lost against Diego Lopez, just because Carlos Prates lost against Ian Gary, just because Mauricio Ruffy lost against BSD, and just because Caio lost against Nasruddin Imavov, it doesn't mean these guys aren't going to be good fighters. I still am very high on honestly everybody, in particular Caio, Carlos Prates, and most importantly Jean Silva, but at the end of the day, I just think it's something that a lot of fans get wrong, and it's happened countless times in the past, and it will probably happen countless times going forward as well. But I guess only time will tell what does end up happening for this entire Fighting Nerds team, but as I said, I do expect them to be very successful going forward, and at the very least, I do expect at least Jean Silva to become a champion out of this team. But anyways, let me know what you guys think in the comments. Do you think the Fighting Nerds are legitimate frauds, or do you not think so? But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you did enjoy, check one of these 2 videos popping up now, and until the next time, peace out guys.